Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here tonight for the City of New Orleans Heat Action Planning public meeting. We're really excited to work with you all and to present what we've already done and how we can continue working together going forward. My name is Meredith McInturf. I'm the Public Health Emergencies and Environmental Health Manager for the New Orleans Health and Human Services Department in the Office of Public Health and Policy. I'm representing the team of dedicated individuals from the Office of Sustainability and the Hazard Mitigation Office who are working together with other city departments to find ways to develop new strategies and collaborate more on existing strategies around extreme heat risk and health. Our purpose and why we're here today is really to share progress with you about what the City of New Orleans has already heard from our residents and particularly those that are most at risk of heat-related illness. Earlier this month, we launched a public survey, which can be found at NOLA.gov/heat-plan, which allows residents to share all of their input on what actions they would like to see prioritized. And we would really encourage you all to complete this survey over the next month and share it widely with your friends, your family, your neighbors, your coworkers, and really encourage them to complete it to get engaged with these city efforts. As many of you remember, in 2023, New Orleans experienced the hottest summer on record with 28 reported heat-related deaths between April to October. And that fall, Councilmember Moreno then, and now Mayor Moreno, announced that there would be funding allocated to develop an urban heat analysis with the goal of developing strategies to protect life and property. And so over the past year or so, we have been continuing to do that through a competitive RFP process where the city selected Arup as the contractor to lead this work. Next slide. Over the past, sorry, I hopped ahead. So for the agenda, for the plan development, really over that time, we defined the problem to start off in April of 2025. Really establishing a basic understanding of the heat impacts in New Orleans and what was currently happening on the ground and what was on plans. Solutions that were being implemented locally and how they compared to national standards and best practices. We held focus groups later in the fall with the support of TVG planning, with particularly focusing on those that had lived experiences with extreme heat. Which brought us to the point where we are now, which is today with the public meeting, and really, promoting our public survey and telling you where we're at so far and where there's still a lot of places and room to grow. And so I guess we can go back to the agenda for the evening where I can go through that. For tonight, we're going to be joined by our partners who are going to, explain kind of where we've been and where we're going. And, focusing on first the introduction to just heat impacts in the city. And then going through the public engagement plan and strategies with TVG, and then demonstrating some example strategies and ways that we could move forward, with the support and backing of individuals across city departments and residents and other community groups alike. We'll also have time for question and answers at the end of the presentation. So if at any point during the presentation you have a question, feel free to use the Q&A chat box. We will kind of save all of those for the end of the presentation, but we will try to get to as many as we can and answer those thoroughly. We know that not everyone who wanted to be involved in this plan could be here tonight as well, so we'll be posting this recording as well as translating it with the transcription on the HEAT website, so NOLA.gov/HEAT-plan. All right, next slide. And then today, I'm really pleased to introduce you all to the consultant team that's been working tirelessly on this work over the last year or so. We'll start off with Arup, and we'll have Maggie and Shika presenting most of their work. We have TVG planning with Corinne and Delaney, and Agaru Consulting with Maggie, and REAG planning as well with Chris. So really happy to pass it off to Maggie to kind of give an overview of the project.
Hey, well, the first slide will actually have Shika speak next about the heat impacts in NOLA. These were part of our assessment last year during 2025 to basically establish a foundational understanding of heat impacts across New Orleans and kind of compare that to the situation nationally and internationally. So with that, I'll pass it to Shika.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shika. I sit in the Arab San Francisco office, and I'm excited to kick off our presentation with the research that Maggie was referring to. So we wanted to first start by discussing how extreme heat affects the city of New Orleans. Extreme heat refers to periods when the air temperature or heat index value rise significantly above normal conditions, and heat index is a term that describes how hot it feels when relative humidity is added to air temperature, so very relevant for the city of New Orleans. Typically in the city, the new National Weather Service will issue alerts when there's heat risk in New Orleans based on the following thresholds: a heat advisory and then an excessive heat warning. A heat advisory is called when the heat index is higher than 108 degrees Fahrenheit, or the forecasted temperature is higher than 103 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 to 2 days. And the excessive heat warning is triggered when the heat index is higher than 113 degrees Fahrenheit, or the forecasted temperature is higher than 105 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 2 days. These are typically the temperatures where you might receive a NOLA ready alert. We now wanted to discuss the impacts of overheating to day-to-day lives, critical services, and infrastructure. These impacts are interconnected and often disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. The first being loss of life or injury. As Meredith mentioned, in 2023, there was extreme heat events that resulted in 28 heat-related fatalities and 367 heat-related emergency service calls. These were largely from people who are experiencing direct heat impacts. However, heat can also worsen health with for those with chronic illnesses, including cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, or kidneys disease. Both of these factors add even more burden on local healthcare systems, making it hard to help all patients during extreme heat events. Another critical impact is to local ecosystems and biodiversity. Not all plants can survive hotter than normal climates, which may hurt and affect local agriculture, community gardens, and public parks. These may also worsen existing access issues to green space in the city. Increased temperatures also lead to higher water use in order to offset the heat and the drought conditions, which is also difficult when it comes to achieving sustainability goals as well. Overall, residents in cities will experience decreased well-being and health concerns. Children may face higher risks when playing outdoors or participating in after-school activities under high heat conditions. Those who are walking, biking, or using public transit will have to be even more careful about the timing and exposure to heat along the way. It can really disrupt everyday routines and mental health. Power outages during heat waves can also be life-threatening. Those who may lose access to air conditioning can't cool themselves at home, which is really dangerous for some of the health issues that we've talked about. And then loss of power to medical devices that people may rely on may also disrupt any critical services that they need. There's definitely health issues and risks to our day-to-day lives, but businesses and service providers may also experience a lot of disruptions, which can lead to less productivity, loss of income for workers, and increasing repair costs. Heat limits our ability to work outdoors safely and can contribute to poor sleep, which lowers productivity and increases injury risk. One study estimates that there are over 20,000 heat-related workplace injuries in the US annually, across both indoor and outdoor jobs. The industries that are most exposed in the city of New Orleans are construction, landscaping, roofing, dock and sanitation workers, warehouse workers if there's not adequate cooling, delivery drivers, and even indoors with back-of-house kitchen staff, for example. Heat-related power outages affect businesses that may rely on refrigeration, which may spoil product and lose revenue, cause lost revenue. It may reduce operating hours of certain businesses and even delay construction. It generally will make it harder to provide services that the city relies on. Extreme heat can also lead to higher maintenance costs for water pipes when there's low levels of water. Roadways may become softer and crack under high heat conditions, and the electrical grid also has reduced capacity to provide energy to residents. These impacts will increase repair and maintenance costs for cities. Residents may face increased energy bills as a result, and those who are unable to work or reach their destination safely may face greater financial burden generally. The extreme heat that we're experiencing is largely driven by two main factors: climate change and the urban heat island or UHI effect. These factors don't necessarily act independently. They really compound one another, especially in cities like New Orleans. The first factor is climate change, which is causing increasing heat waves and longer warm seasons. Climate change is primarily driven by greenhouse gas emissions that trap heat in the atmosphere and raise baseline temperatures worldwide. As these temperatures rise, heat waves become more common, longer lasting, and more dangerous, even before local factors are considered. The second major contributor is the urban heat island effect, or UHI effect, which describes elevated temperatures in urban areas compared to surrounding rural or natural regions. This is because roads, buildings, and sidewalks, which are often in higher density in cities, can trap heat, and there's limited green space that helps offset that. New Orleans in particular experiences a pronounced urban heat island effect, as some citywide data shows that neighborhoods can be up to 8 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than less developed or greener areas. Heat waves under urban heat island effect conditions can interact and amplify the health risks and other risks that we had talked about in the previous slide. In general, 2026 is looking to be one of the hottest years on record, and this trend might continue, so it's important to consider how that may affect the city of New Orleans. Over the next century, New Orleans is projected to experience even more heat danger days, which is a metric that describes when the wet bulb globe temperature, which describes how heat is felt in direct sunlight, reaches or exceeds 88 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is a temperature that is not necessarily cause for a heat wave, but hot enough to lead to more heat stress, exhaustion, or heat stroke when people are outside, working, recreating, or commuting. The number of heat danger days is projected to increase from a historical baseline of 65 days per year to about 89 days per year by mid-century and an estimated 150 days per year by the end of the century. So potentially 3 more months a year by the end of the century for these elevated heat days. Heat waves are also a particular example of an extreme heat event where there's at least 2 days of abnormal extreme heat that exceeds average temperatures. According to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, NOLA is at relatively high risk for heat waves. So if you look at a map of the US on the right, most regions are at very low, relatively low, or even relatively moderate heat risk from the blue and yellow colorings, but NOLA, like some of the other cities on the southwest and the southeast, is at relatively high heat risk. These temperatures are not often evenly distributed and often align with patterns of development, infrastructure, and disinvestment, as we'll discuss in later slides. And in 2023, the heat wave in NOLA really highlighted how dangerous heat waves may be. That year, the New Orleans Health Department, as we discussed before, reported 28 heat-related fatalities and over 400 emergency room visits, likely driven up by this heat wave. I'll now pass it to Chris to discuss some of the ties between heat exposure and other indicators in some of the mapping work that we've done. Chris, feel free to say next slide when you're ready to navigate forward.
Thank you very much. So this map shows national data from the CDC. It's the Heat and Health Index for Orleans Parish, and that combines 2 measures. It's the number of extreme heat days, which is the days exceeding the 95th percentile of historical temperatures, and the rate of heat-related EMS activations from 2020 to 2022. The darker areas, which you can see concentrated in the western and central parts of the parish, reflect a high to very high historical heat and health burden. And what this map is telling us is that the burden is not spread evenly across the city. The same neighborhoods that we're going to see flagged for social vulnerability and energy insecurity are also where heat is most likely to become a health emergency. So keep this initial map in mind as we move on to the next slide. This next map, instead of showing us national data, is showing us local data on heat-related emergency calls by zip code for 2023 and 2024. The darkest areas are the ones with the most calls, and they're also concentrated in the central and western parts of the parish. It's the same geography that we saw flagged on the previous map. This pattern reinforces what the national data showed us, that heat-related emergencies are not evenly distributed and they cluster in the same parts of the city year after year. Next slide, please. Next, we're looking at urban heat island severity on much finer grain detail. The deep reds are very severe to extreme heat island severity, and these blanket the urban core. It's downtown, central city, and the neighborhoods running along the river. As you move towards the less developed areas of the city, the intensity fades to oranges and yellows. What drives those hotspots? It's largely pavement, dark rooftops, and the absence of tree canopy, features that concentrate in lower income neighborhoods as a direct legacy of how the city was built and who was allowed to invest in it. Recent research confirms that in New Orleans, low-income neighborhoods show higher heat conditions and lower heat tree cover. The same communities are also more likely to lack health insurance. 24% of Hispanic residents are uninsured, nearly 4 times the rate of Asian and white residents. Climate change also adds pressure from another direction. Warming temperatures increase flood risk and sea level rise, threats that will disproportionately fall on the same communities that are already absorbing the most heat. Next slide, please. This next map shows the number of energy burden households. Those are defined as households spending more than 6% of their income on energy bills. Some of the darkest blue census tracts, which show the most burden, are located in the eastern portions of the city and along a band running through the center of the parish. The western urban core shows a little bit more variation with a mix of moderate to high burden across these smaller census tracts. Why this is important is because where heat exposure meets a limited ability to afford cooling is where the risk compounds upon itself. Citywide, 27% of census tracts carry a high energy burden, and low-income residents make up the majority in nearly all of those same census tracts. Nationally, about a third of households face energy insecurity, often in homes with poor insulation or aging systems. The result is a troubling combination. Heat drives up energy demand, high costs limit the ability to afford to air-conditioned homes, and insufficient cooling increases health risk. Next slide, please. This next slide, so we've got 2 maps on the right. On the left is the original Homeowners Loan Corporation map of New Orleans, known to many as the redlining map. On the right is the Urban Heat Island Severity map that we looked at earlier. And the similarity in the pattern is striking. The neighborhoods that were colored red and deemed hazardous, concentrating Black, poor, and working class residents in dense, underinvested environments, are the same neighborhoods today that show up as the hottest. That's not a coincidence. Redlining shaped where trees were planted, where parks were built, what kinds of buildings went up, and who had the resources to maintain them. Those decisions echo forward into the heat maps that we've been looking at today. Hurricane Katrina added yet another layer. Differential access to recovery resources combined with longstanding inequities in property ownership accelerated gentrification and widened the wealth gap. The result is an overlapping set of vulnerabilities: race, gender, age, housing status, tree cover, and income. Black residents face the highest fatality rates. Pregnant women and people with chronic heart conditions face elevated physiological risk. Adults over 65 account for the majority of heat deaths, and people experiencing homelessness or without air conditioning have almost no buffer. Energy burden ties a lot of these elements together, limiting the one tool most households have to manage heat at home. These aren't separate problems, they're the layered result of decisions made over generations, and they show up clearly in the data. I think on to public engagement.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, Delaney from TVG here. Thank you everyone for joining today. Before I pass it to my colleague Maggie Pullen to start off the public engagement sector, I just wanted to let everyone know that we do have a Q&A section that is active in the call. So if you all have any questions or anything as we are going through, feel free to put them in the Q&A section. And at the end of the meeting, within the last 15 minutes or so, we're going to circle back to all of those and get those questions answered for you all. Also, if anyone on the call has any language access needs between Spanish and Vietnamese, our project team can help out with that. And we also have Miss Tina Owen on the call as well for any Vietnamese translations needed. Please feel free to announce that in the Q&A as well. And we can go from there. Maggie, I'll pass it to you now.
Thank you, Delaney. Hi, I'm Maggie Pullen. I'm the founder and principal of Agaro Consulting, and I worked with the Villavasa Group team on the public engagement. So, we reached out to specific populations for our engagement, and we relied on empirical studies as well as the heat maps. Chris just gave you a great summary and overview of what that looks like for the city to determine the groups that we would target in our outreach. We also worked with the city to identify specific individuals representing each group so that we could could ensure that we had, a wide breadth of perspectives that we could gather for the outreach. So we focused on speaking with people representing the aging population, or our seniors, culture bearers, outdoor workers, transit dependent residents, people experiencing homelessness, families, women, and children. A big reason why we really targeted this was not only from what we learned from the mapping and the empirical studies, but also understanding that often they face overlapping impacts. So, having limited access to cooling, prolonged outdoor exposure, and vulnerability and health, economic mobility and economic health and mobility vulnerabilities. And so we understand that this compounds the impacts on these populations. The excessive heat does that. So we'll move on to the next slide to talk a little bit about the outreach that we did. We were very intentional in the way. Oh, yes.
Maggie, sorry, I just wanted to note that there is somebody with their hand up, Dana. It looks like Dana Ness. If you wouldn't mind to drop your comment in the Q&A, and then we'll hold the questions till the end. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So in terms of our outreach, we started first with working, with the city and with trusted service providers to reach representatives of the groups that we just mentioned in the previous slide. We started as well with phone calls to people, followed by emails, and then following up with phone calls again, beginning in about early September. And we carried on through really until the very last focus groups that we held to make sure that we were, trying to increase and get in touch as many people as possible on each of the opportunities that we had for consultations. So we had one pop-up in-person event that we attended, and then we held 6 focus groups. One of those focus groups was in person and the other was virtual. Overall, we touched about 143 people through the consultations that we held. And so in the consultations that we held, we also wanted to make sure that we were employing tactics that allowed people to contribute in the way that they felt comfortable. So we, in addition to be able to contribute virtually, in person as well, verbally, in person as well as virtually, we also implemented chats. We implemented, we had sticky notes for the in-person groups to allow those that maybe did not want to speak up as much to be able to contribute and share their thoughts. And so on the following slides, we're going to lay out for you what we heard from each of the groups. That's in terms of the kind of challenges that they faced and the barriers to keeping cool that they face, as well as their ideas of solutions that could be incorporated into the recommendations. And so we really wanted to make sure that we gather the information and that we're using that to directly inform the recommendations that you'll see from Arup towards the end of this presentation. So the first target group that we touched was the senior population. We did this through tabling and surveying them at the Senior Voters Caucus annual meeting on September 17th. And so what we heard is that essentially, they really struggle to stay cool, both in their homes as well as outside their homes. Many reside in older homes with poor insulation or low ventilation, and perhaps their outdoor spaces are not well ventilated either. So it's also quite hard for them to stay cool. They have a mixed awareness of the cooling centers. A lot of us that get those NOLA Ready alerts, we understand, we see, and we may know where they are, but those that don't necessarily use mobile phones or have the access to those alerts don't know about them as well. They also sometimes don't want to go. They could be far away. There could be transit issues to get there. It could incur a long walk, which just compounds the heat impacts. And then on top of that, this population is predominantly on a fixed income. And so the energy cost burden to them as well was something that was expressed through the consultations that we held. So we also asked, what would work? What do they think would be practical solutions to help alleviate the impacts of heat on them? And there was a lot of talk around targeted outreach to seniors, particularly maybe more accessible information for them to be able to know about where cooling centers are, how to be aware of heat symptoms and such to know when they need to take steps to stay cool. Also, there could be improved transportation and access to cooling centers. Perhaps that's expanding cooling centers in the city, so they're in closer to people, so they're not having to take long transit rides and such and walks to get there. And then finally, relating to that, the fact that they are on fixed incomes, if there could be some sort of funding provision for those in this bracket, particularly when the heat reaches a certain temperature and it's quite hot. So the next group that we spoke to were the culture bearers, and so these were musicians who took part. Apologies, my mic. Okay, who took part in the predominantly there's really insufficient shade and access to cooling resources at performances and events. This could be during parades or Super Sundays, as well as specific music performances and other cultural performances in public spaces. We also heard about the disparities in provisions at particular festivals and performances. And so, Jazz Fest came up, and there was a comparison made to the single tent that's provided to, the culture bearers and Mardi Gras Indians who are wearing very hot and heavy costumes and perhaps only have access to a few chairs and a few fans versus what might be provided for other performers at Jazz Fest. This also exacerbates the health risks and emergencies that occur for them. They talked a bit about instances where performers maybe don't realize that they're experiencing the symptoms of extreme heat and continue to perform, and the impacts this can have, and the need to call emergency services in these situations. And then kind of conversely, we talk about equity concerns in respect to the fact that, if they're not performing, they're not getting paid, and a lot of them don't have insurance. And so there's double economic impact there, where if they do need to leave or be taken to the hospital because of a heat emergency, they're losing income. And then on top of that, they may be incurring a very large medical expense. So they noted a few areas of town and particular events that are hot. And so, of course, Jazz Fest, Congo Square stage came up a lot. If anyone's, I know plenty of you have been to Jazz Fest and know that Congo Square is the only one that faces directly in the sun, where performers are facing directly in the sun. French Quarter and Gentilly Fest were also mentioned in terms of the low tree canopy that's there. This was also something that was highlighted for the Broad Street and Claiborne corridors, where there's low tree canopy. It was even emphasized that as soon as they turn for downtown Super Sunday from Orleans onto Broad, that it gets particularly hot during that day and during that performance. So in terms of ideas for solutions, they mentioned expanding shade and event hotspots. That would be more tree canopy along the corridors, as well as in the particular areas where events take place. So whether that's downtown for French Quarter Fest or Gentilly Fest. Also possibly having water stations on routes, particularly, for example, during Super Sunday. They also talked about the city possibly mandating heat safety plans and provision requirements for event permitting, and having culture bearers be a part, being represented in event planning in relation to this, so that their perspectives and their experiences are taken into consideration when these events are being planned. And then finally, they talked about training and education for this sector of the population, particularly on personal cooling options and how to know and recognize the impacts of extreme heat. Okay, so we held a virtual focus group for those representing outdoor workers in the city. As I mentioned, we wanted to make sure that we selected participants in these groups that could represent a broad breadth of experiences. And so we spoke to industry leaders from the construction, energy, telecoms, and engineering industries, as well as public works. They emphasize the kind of localized situational factors and the microclimates. And I think that, Chris talked about that a little bit. And we saw like on the maps, how it's not particularly just one neighborhood. It could be a block away is a lot cooler than than 2 blocks the other way. And so this also impacted, their ability to be able to make sure that their workers are cool because they arrive at a place that's particularly hotter than where they just were. However, they do provide a lot of their own provisions. They just talked about also the low tree canopy in many areas of the city too. Something that came up quite a bit with them was around city ordinances and the requirements that the city has for these industries to take steps to keep their workers cool, and balancing that with the need to be able to get out and do work to maintain the infrastructure in the city. And it's kind of like the cycle, as Shika demonstrated, that the infrastructure of the city is impacted by extreme heat. We also need the outdoor workers to be taking care of improving and repairing that infrastructure. And so there's a balance between when the temperature threshold for when they can be out and what the city is planning and mandating versus like what's practical in terms of the industry. And so making sure that they're involved in that planning was something that came up as well. And then we also heard again about the education piece. So, worker knowledge around extreme heat symptoms and how to stay cool came up as well. And in terms of solutions, similar to what we heard in the Culture Bears, training and education for outdoor workers to understand their own safety and how to keep others that they work with safe, possibly having on-site resources and mobile cooling solutions, and then also having action alerts and actionable guidance. And so this was something that was a pattern that we heard across a few of the focus groups, was having action alerts that are tailored to particular groups, such as outdoor workers or seniors, or families and such, around the specific things that they can do that might be a bit more particular to them and their groups. They also talked about having improved heat mapping in the city so they know where those microclimates exist that could be hotter, and then they can make provisions ahead of time to be able to protect their workers. And then finally, having a more cross-sector coordination and flexible approach from the city in terms of the ordinances and such that they develop related to mitigating heat. I'm going to pass it on now to Delaney, who's going to talk to you about the other groups that we spoke with.
Thank you, Maggie. Moving on to our transit-dependent community members, this was also another virtual focus group that we conducted with leaders of transit organizations, as well as transit and biking advocacy groups. The main concern here for the transit-dependent was lack of shelter and seating. We also heard that a lot of people were complaining, or not really complaining, but expressing concerns about how we have some aging fleets within our public transit, which then results in insufficient cooling on the actual transit itself. Also, when they're out there with the limited shelters and seatings, there is a lot of inconsistency with the timing and the detours that they take, which ultimately, when people have unannounced detours on the transit or buses or however they're traveling about, that means that people may have to walk further to stops in hot weather, which that frequent inconsistency means that they're spending more time outside than actually getting to where they need to go. Some of the other concerns that they mentioned were limited hydration and restrooms. So again, like Maggie said earlier, access to more cooling centers, access to more water sources that are available outside, as well as more low tree canopy and bicycle corridors. I think that one was another common theme that we're going to see throughout each of the groups. And we can go to the next slide. So for our transit-dependent community, for the ideas for solutions, we heard from them that it would be best to improve and expand shade and seating. So this is mainly within like the shelters themselves. As we all know, there are a lot of shelters that only have a limited amount of seating, and some of them actually only provide seating itself and not the actual shade that is accompanied with it. Definitely upgrades for electric and hybrid fleets. So increasing the more modern buses and different transit options that we have so that they do have access to actual cooling within the bus, as well as more information around hydration and cooling centers around the city. Green infrastructure, so pavement, cross-agency and civic organization collaboration, and real-time notifications that will contribute to those detours and cooling resources to not have them standing outside or having long wait times while they're waiting to go where they need to go. And our next focus group was people experiencing homelessness. This was conducted with organizations that specifically serve the unhoused, mental health shelters, affordable housing, youth homelessness, etc. Their main concerns and insights were about prolonged heat exposure. So given the circumstances, them being unhoused and in the heat more than any of our other focus groups for an extended period of time. They have, again, expressed concerns like the transit-dependent individuals in frequent transit and long walks, as well as physical and behavioral heat impacts. Most of the individuals within our population for experiencing homelessness are actually outside all day, and the shelters close sometimes during the day, so they're estimated to be outside much longer with inconsistent availability to these cooling centers and resources for how they can stay cool. So there was also a concern about limited gaps in communication on heat risk and resources, not only because they're just not available within the shelters themselves, but a lot of these people do not have access to the online materials or even just spaces where we would normally even post these types of communications. So that was another thing. And then also they expressed concerns with frequent areas are also high risk. So low shade with limited hydration resources and provisions. Some of the ideas for solutions that we discussed were, again, another common theme, shaded structures, canopies, stations for hydration in frequented locations. They would also need direct, clear outreach on resources. So thinking outside of the box with how we can directly target communications to the homeless population, given that they don't have the technology or the phone sources available. That may include partnering with different organizations that help to mitigate homelessness, as well as centralized sites with cooling information and water. So, for example, those hydration sites that most of our populations and focus groups are requesting, if we could have that information around cooling centers and water access there, I think that would genuinely help all the focus groups to be aware of how they can mitigate the heat, as well as cooling center provisions, lower heat response activation thresholds, and coordination between city agencies, EMS, and different service providers. And moving on to families, women, and children, another virtual focus group that we conducted. Their insights were pretty much similar to our other focus groups as well. Honestly, what was most interesting about this with families, women, and children, we spoke to a lot of different youth groups that actually said that children are less likely to be aware of the actual heat impacts and mitigation. So being that they are youth-based and led groups, they're having to warn them about ideal play times, staying informed on when the sun and the heat is actually the highest. So that can make these programs that are designed for family, women, and children less productive because they have less physical activity because of the extreme heat. So cutting down on recess, cutting down on outdoor activities, less workout time and outside time for women who are pregnant or want to bring their kids outside. Kids also are privy to, kids are also more likely to have dehydration and heat illness when playing out in the sun. And then the lack of shade and limiting cooling resources limits families from frequenting certain places. And also the heat also causes an energy cost burden for families. And it has insufficient age group alerts. So for example, like I mentioned earlier, with a lot of these youth groups, it's up for the teachers, counselors, people who are on the staff to inform them of these alerts. So one of the other things that we heard around education is just making sure that not only the youth are informed, but the teachers, as well as anyone else that are dealing with people who are outside and on the younger or immune compromised side of things. So some of the solutions that we heard from this focus group was expanding more shade around areas for them, more cooling surfaces, specifically, especially for the kids to play on, adding any hydration facilities and frequent family corridors where they have access to more shade and access to more cooling centers. Also adding some tailored alerts by age and heat threshold. So maybe that mean targeting specific age groups specifically to talk about heat mitigation and prevention within the youth as well as any of the adults, and then better coordination among family and youth serving organizations and city health park agencies. So as we've heard, and Maggie mentioned some of these as well, the main consistent themes across all 6 of these groups were availability and access to cooling resources, and the impact of insufficient transit service and shelters, a general lack of shade and low tree canopy. We've heard that a couple of times. The main cross-sector coordination with this would be government agencies, service providers, employers, and cultural representatives. They're all experiencing the same things when they're out. So these are some of the main themes that we should focus on as far as mitigating those challenges that they have. Next slide. Okay, and some additional consistent themes across groups. Communication alerts, improving on communication alerts, outreach, tailored messaging, of course, increasing shade provisions, better protected transit, hydrating and cooling center access, and again, cross-sector coordination across all of the 6 focus groups that we mentioned. And I will now pass it to Arup or Arup or Ashika to go into strategies.
Hey, I'm Maggie Messerschmidt with Arup, and I'll be taking us through the strategies that we're incorporating into the actual heat action plan. So a lot of what we heard has a place within the strategies that we're looking at. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk us through what we've been up to. To develop the strategies, we have reviewed over 17 plans across the city that include different heat response or heat mitigation components. So that includes things like the emergency operations plan that you see there, as well as the climate action plan, net zero by 2050. We also took a look at the city's master plan, reforestation plan, a report on equity and climate change for New Orleans, the youth master plan, and the draft hazard mitigation plan. And importantly, some of the heat actions that are going on in the city are already going on out there, but they're not necessarily coordinated efforts. So part of the effort here is to bring this together so that there's clear vision and goals and metrics associated with these heat actions, and then fill in any gaps. So after we catalog the existing efforts, we also are taking a look at heat resilience plans from cities like Boston and Austin and Miami. Our team worked on a heat action framework for Los Angeles, so we're folding that in, and our learnings from those places about best practice. And then, of course, we are also taking the findings from the focus groups and the surveys that we're looking for your feedback on today, and we're including those around the specific goals and flagging certain actions as community priorities within the catalog of heat strategies that we're developing. So we'll continue to kind of refine this as we get feedback, but I can share with you how this is kind of all panning out in the next slide. There are 6 main strategies, and then under each strategy there are several actions, and then there are 2 goals. So that's why you see the yellow and the blue. So the first goal is around relief during heat waves, and the second goal is around actually creating cooler communities. So the first is kind of a short term, like let's handle an emergency when it comes, and the second goal is around actually longer term cooling and making sure that we're prepared for when those heat waves hit. So under relief during heat waves, we've got things like preparing the city's internal capacity for a heat response, educating, training, and preparing the community, and responding to heat waves themselves. And then under creating cooler communities, we have creating cooler buildings and indoor spaces, cooling outdoor and public spaces, and then preparing our energy infrastructure for heat impacts. So I'm going to walk you through some examples, but before we do that, I just wanted to stress that all of this is going to towards a few essential outcomes, and those are related to health, livability, and savings. On the health side, of course, the main goal is to reduce the number of heat-related illnesses and deaths or other health-related impacts. We're also hoping to improve the livability and comfort in people's day-to-day lives so that people can be comfortable commuting around, getting out, doing the activities that make life worth living. And then on the saving side, we are focused on reducing the economic burden of heat impacts, and that includes things at the household level, like that energy burden we were talking about at the household level. The impact on local businesses, and then also public dollars, making sure that we're investing early so that in the long run, we're actually mitigating those accumulating costs over time. Okay, so this is an example of a heat action from that first goal area A, so one of the 6 goal areas. And the action here that you're seeing is monitoring and reporting to heat-related data. And this corresponds to a strategy, which is preparing the city's internal capacity for heat response. So this is something that the city is already working on. You see there some of the leadership that is involved in coordinating that effort, including the health department. Meredith is part of that. Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, Emergency Medical Services, and the Parish Coroner's Office. And some of those activities that they could continue working on and continue coordinating on include developing standard operating procedures for data collection, including monitoring actual heat events, healthcare, the relationship between those events, and some of the heat emergencies like the 311 calls, and basically having a better set of data that can be referred to understand the ongoing impacts of heat, and also how successful we are in driving down those heat-related illnesses and deaths, especially as heat waves are increasing. And then the metrics for success there could be an annual heat and health report. And then on the next slide, we have another action. This is under strategy B, which focuses on education, training, and preparing the community. So an example of that is delivering heat information to communities, potentially potentially via websites, especially regarding peak heat season and what to do to be prepared. And so some potential metrics for success there could include communication materials that are distributed in multiple languages and that reach a wider distribution than they currently do. Okay, and then under strategy C, that involves responding to heat waves. There is this potential action around surging capacity to distribute water, fans, cooling towels, ice packs, and other resources during heat events. And again, the metric of success there would be around the coverage and distribution of the cooling supplies. Okay, and then strategy D involves creating cooler buildings and indoor spaces. So an example of an action there would be retrofitting and weatherizing homes for heat resilience. That would be led by the Office of Sustainability, the Engagement Office, and the Communications team. And basically would focus on home weatherization to keep the cold air in and the hot air out, and identify funding sources to support those retrofits in residential properties. And so that, again, would involve kind of counting or the distribution of that program and the number of weatherization projects that are successfully implemented. And then on the next one, we're under the second set of strategies, which is more about creating the cooler communities. The goal there would be around cooling outdoor spaces and specifically focusing on blue infrastructure, which is, things like splash pads and swimming pools. So an action there could be designing and building splash pads with cooling features and shaded structures there too. And then making sure that the distribution of those is equitable across the city. And then creating cooler communities also includes a goal around preparing energy infrastructure for heat impacts. So the city, specifically the Hazard Mitigation Office, could continue to develop a relationship with Entergy around really handling those peak loads during heat waves. And that might involve a strategy around distributed energy resources like microgrids or solar panels, but helping to keep the lights on during the heat events and making sure that we have backup power at all the critical places, including cooling centers. And so, of course, we would continue to work with Entergy to make sure that there are fewer blackouts and brownouts, especially during heat waves, and capacity to meet long-term energy demand for cooling, or also improve just demand management so that the grid can handle these spikes in demand. Okay, so once we integrate all of the findings and strategies into the heat action plan, it will set the city up for the next steps, which include integrating those plans, including the hazard mitigation plan, which is forthcoming. And it's an opportunity for interdepartmental conversations to really kind of build the structure and the accountability and the governance for implementation of the plan. Then there will need to be some further prioritization regarding what are some of the easy wins, the things that are already ongoing, but also where should investment be made to basically build capacity for those high impact strategies. And then finally, they'll need to fund the gaps with resources such as the FEMA BRIC program, which is now back online, or look for opportunities for collaboration and partnerships with community-based organizations or between departments for implementation. And so, again, just revisiting this project development timeline, we are in the stages where we're developing the report, taking all the feedback that we're getting from the focus groups, the surveys, our look across other cities' plans, and incorporating that into kind of a catalog of heat strategies. And then we'll deliver the first draft to the city by June 1st. And then following that, there will be a review by the mayor's office and discussion of plan adoption and further implementation. And I wanted to note there that the project deliverables so far are available at that website, nola.gov/heat plan. So you can go there also to access the survey that we've been talking about. We'd love your input on that, or the input of any of the residents or community members that you work with. And with that, I will pass it back to Meredith.
Thank you so much, Maggie. That was a great overview of what we've gone through, and thank you all for presenting about the different pieces. So you'll see on this slide that we do have a shared email address between all of the different members of the interdepartmental teams that are working on the heat plan. So just so that we all have eyes on it and can answer your questions appropriately, if you have questions following today's meeting, you can always email them to heatteam@nola.gov. And this will make sure that we can have a good answer for you that's well-rounded across departments. But we are going to move into a Q&A time. I see that it looks like maybe somebody wrote something in the chat or the Q&A, but feel free to use that, and we will take some time to kind of go through those questions and answers, and that'll be from the city side or from the consultants, and happy to answer what we can. We'll give everyone a few minutes to think too, because I know that was a lot of information.
And we also put the link to the survey in the chat so that people can navigate there. Or in the, I guess in the Q&A we can put it.
I did just add a few minutes ago a link to the survey there, but if you all can't see it, let me know. I can resend.
I see it now. Thank you.
Dana, let me see how to let you speak if that's easier. If you have a question, I think we can unmute you. Let's see. Dana, did you have a question? I think you can unmute yourself now. But perhaps we can't hear you. Hold on. It looks like you're unmuted.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, sorry, is my headphones interfering? Yeah, I did not, was not unable to find the Q&A link, and that's why I raised my hand earlier, so I apologize for that. But can I just go ahead and ask you my question?
Sure.
I'm just curious as to why depaving was not included as a strategy. And sorry, I'm getting some interference here. Yeah, sorry about that. And also, you know, nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, rain gardens, that sort of thing. On slide 14, you mentioned specifically that pavement is a major issue, and it is an equity issue as well, that the areas, lower income areas tend to have more paving, and that drives up the heat, but it isn't explicitly mentioned in this survey. And I wonder why that was, if that was a choice or a decision, and if so, why?
No, it's should be included. Absolutely. You're wise and to make that comment. I can say that the green infrastructure is one of the major strategies under cooling outdoor and public spaces. It's also part of cooling buildings, frankly. So nature-based solutions could include everything from, you know, porous pavers to, you know, not using so much pavement in some locations, or, you know, even the transition of vacant lots into like community gardens, things like that. So there is definitely, these are, I just want to clarify that these are high level strategies. And so each of the 6 examples we gave were just like a snippet of what might go under each of the strategies from A to F. And so green infrastructure, tree, you know, of course, the tree canopy being essential, shade being essential in general to combating heat impacts is very important, and are absolutely part, I mean, the icon itself, I think, speaks to that under strategy E. So that should be included. And as far as the survey goes, I'm not, I can't recall exactly if it was called green infrastructure, or maybe we tried to stay away from like terms that might not be understood by the general public. So maybe it was called out as like trees or shade, but you're welcome to add that, but please be assured that we will be including a lot about green infrastructure in this plan.
It looks like we have another question that was just posted in the Q&A. I don't know if everyone can see that on you guys' end.
Yes, I can. So the question that was posed was, how soon will we be able to see changes around the city, such as seats and shading for bus stops and cooling stations? And so that's a great question. And that is a little bit of what I think Maggie dug into toward the end of her presentation. A lot of these strategies some of them are ongoing. And I'll say that the shading and the cooling stations is definitely an ongoing conversation. And there are groups locally that are advocating for this already. But, this is something that we hope to bring to, the attention of the mayor's office and to other groups that are, exploring funding options to continue investing in that. So, I think currently, to my understanding, there's funding for some locations, but maybe not all. And so I think the other part of that is lifting up the communications of some of the other agencies or organizations locally, like when those things are happening, and just making sure that we're aware of, those things. But it's a little hard to say an exact timeline for some of that as of right now. But that would be the goal of this plan, is to kind of set those markers for success. And define clearly which agencies are responsible for the updates and the progress on those different projects. Any other questions coming up?
It's another point about I'm thinking about Dana's comment and how Chris mentioned at the beginning some of the flood risk that we're seeing in certain parts of the city that coincide with areas of high heat. And so those are really great opportunities for kind of using strategies that have dual, kind of dual purposes. So both the flood risk mitigation through green stormwater infrastructure and the cooling impacts of that.
Okay, in the chat, I see a question about when did this work on the heat action plan begin and how is it being funded? So I can actually post a short snippet that was shared by council when it was passed originally. I had that pulled up earlier this week, but originally the kind of council action around this happened in September of 2023. The funding, I believe, was actually allocated to the Office of Sustainability in early or possibly mid 2024. And then there was an RFP that was put out soon after that. I know it went out to bid several times, so that took a few months in that process to get that going. But then the work began really with the ARUP team after they were selected and the contracts were signed in April of 2025. But I'll add a link as well to that initial release. And the question around how it's being funded is currently funded, I believe, through city general funds, but I can double check that as well. It's not currently a federally funded project.
Do you see the new one from Raymond?
Yeah, sorry, it was loading. It was okay. Yes, from Raymond. Does the city have identified funding for any of the changes, even beyond BRIC funding? So it's a good question. Some of it, I would say, is a little up in the air right now because we don't know all of the prioritized changes or community priorities, and so some of it may truly already be in some of the priorities, locally. For example, I know. In the last hazard mitigation plan update in 2020, one of the priorities at that time was funding for a climate position within the health department, which we do have. And so if that comes up, or that, the capacity to do the data analysis or pieces like that some of that already does exist at the city level. For example, for some of the bigger infrastructure projects, I think a lot of it is going to be about alignment of existing projects and making, either different choices maybe in like materials, or thinking about how we can integrate or align, and really stretching it as much as we can, to really align with all of the heat work. But, in terms of the exact funding, I don't know if Austin is still on as well. He might be able to answer that as well from the hazard mitigation side. But that's definitely a top priority of this work, is to find, sustainable funding sources and not just, one-time funding.
Hey Meredith, can you guys hear me? This is
Yes, we
Austin.
can hear you.
Yeah, well, hey, good evening, everybody. And funding is always difficult and complicated, but federal grants are not the certainly not the only way to implement some of the actions that we're talking about here tonight. Like Meredith kind of hinted at or spoke to, there are ways, whether it's through building codes or just sort of new ways of designing projects, that we can start to incorporate heat relief and cooling measures just into kind of normal renovation reconstruction projects. So I know that's not an answer; it's a non-answer, not specific, but yeah, it's an evolving picture.
Thanks, Austin. I'm going to answer Raymond's second part of his question. Yes, we absolutely do want to include the work of IC Change and the Holly Grove Dixon Neighborhood Association. I know Rachel from the hazard mitigation team was there this past Thursday, and we're very excited to be able to incorporate those findings as well. And so I'll be reaching out to you and Julia from IC Change, and their entire team, just to talk through some of those findings more. But we wanted to make sure that we had aligned strategies. And again, I think that's a really great opportunity to integrate the data that was collected for that report into this as well. And to respond to Dr. St. Charles's response about American Red Cross, I'll also be reaching out to you, and you have my phone number. So that is coming. I think, for other organizations that are interested in getting involved in heat action work, we know that there's a lot to do. A lot of it starts with just basic training. And so, if anyone is interested in that, please reach out to heatteam@nola.gov. We have some of that already ready to go, but definitely more conversations to be had around planning and working together with groups like American Red Cross and many of the other groups that are represented tonight on this call. So, but we'd love to see that also in the survey. So please take the survey and include that information there, of other recommended groups, but, in addition to Red Cross, that you'd like to see involved in that community planning effort.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo too some of those ideas around incorporating some of the strategies into codes or into policies. And I think we absolutely are looking for ways to kind of reinforce existing work, whether that's around decarbonization, some of the weatherization, some of the renewable energy transition, and just other resilience efforts that are going on throughout New Orleans, and then kind of relying on both local and national strategies that are kind of emerging around incentives and policies, like ways to fast track projects that might include some sort of green infrastructure component, things like that can help to incentivize some of these solutions that touch both on heat resilience, but other types of community resilience as well.
Right, these have been some great questions. Any other questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A, or if you want to raise your hand, I can also unmute if that's easier, if you're having issues with the Q&A. Second, let me go in. Right, Corinne, you should be able to unmute now.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to say good evening and hello. I don't have a question, or I just have a comment. Presentation was good. I enjoyed it and just want to say great job.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that.
We appreciate your team, Corinne.
This has been a great experience working with everyone.
Any additional questions or hand raising? Right. If not, as we said before, and Sheikah, I'm not sure if you can flip back to the slide that had the heat team at NOLA.gov. Yeah, that one. For anyone who hasn't yet, please check out NOLA.gov/heat plan. That is really the central place where you can find all of the information we've talked about tonight. And there will be a recording of this meeting as well as the transcripts and the slides if you're interested in digging deeper or sharing with others. But really encourage your network to complete that public heat action survey by May 1st. And then if there are any additional questions, feel free to reach out to heatteam@NOLA.gov and we'll be happy to get them answered. I really appreciate you all's time tonight, and we hope that you have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.